Hello, my name is Vanessa Zallot. I'm a research associate at the Lucerne University of Applied Sciences and Arts, as well as a PhD student at the Institute for Media Science of the University of Basel. And I am very happy to present my research at this conference. I titled my presentation Open, Complex, Messy, Knowledge Making in Interactive Documentary. My research is very much at its beginnings, and I'm really looking forward to your impressions and suggestions. To explain what about and how I'm researching the form of interactive documentary, I should first tell you that my approach is an ethnographic one. So before getting into this PhD, I studied cultural anthropology, and during my studies I dealt a lot with methodological questions of visual ethnography concerned with the production processes and practices of visual ethnography. And with visual ethnography, I mean the production of moving still or other visual and audiovisual material as a method and as part of an ethnographic research and representation process. So, and this is also going hand in hand with the critical reflection of this process. And those questions I always encountered from a queer and the power critical perspective. So asking how the production processes reproduce and are shaped by power relations. And the perspective on production practices is what I'm also doing in this project. So the production practices of interactive documentaries are at the center of my research, but I do not treat them as completely isolated from the outcome. Therefore, I will always also look at the films in question. Empirically, I started half a year ago with a case study, which I thematically kept very open. So over 5 months, I regularly met with a researcher who was producing an interactive documentary as part of a research on a restitution case. And he chose the software Corsica for this, which some of you might know, but for the others, this is a software that lets you add clips to a database and connect them through keywords. So you do not, as you would in other softwares, pre-create a tree-like structure. Actually, you get no visualizations of any structure or any narrative structure, I mean. In fact, here you see the software interfaces. So you have a folder-like overview, an interface editor, and a so-called SNU editor. SNU stands for Smallest Narrative Unit. And in that SNU editor, you can add keywords in whatever way you want. And depending on the keyword organizational structure, it is mostly pretty unforeseeable in the software what clip will be connected to what in the finished film. So through this software, you can create very diverse projects that lie somewhere on this spectrum from completely nonlinear to linear. And it is mostly used for nonlinear purposes. To get a bit more in my research topic, I will now retrace some of the findings from this first case study process, which then ultimately led me to my current research questions. I will be pseudonymizing the person I did a case study with here, as he wishes me to do so. So this is why I will abstract him and his project in a certain way. I will leave out some info and I will call him Christoph. So Christoph did a filmic research on a specific restitution case in a formerly colonized country on the African continent. And in his research, he wanted to be able to find a way of representing his findings that also represented the complexities of the field that he encountered. And that is why Christoph resorted to Corsica, because in this software, he saw the possibility to do just that, represent complexities. Because as he put it, this software doesn't help him to understand his material better. Instead, it helps adding complexities and decontextualizations to his representational practice. And his basic idea for the film was the following. It was not his goal to offer clear answers and clear fixed viewpoints on the restitution case he was researching. In fact, he was rather afraid of producing and representing essentialisms, which of course is a thought over problematic in said field. And in his film, he wanted to show different perspectives, different viewpoints that contradict, that add up, and that make up an incomplete but complex description of the case. That is why he also didn't want to create the impression of completeness in his film, and also why he liked Korsakov, because he said that this software makes it clear from the beginning on that one hasn't seen everything, as he said. In the description of his basic idea, he also opened up a pretty interesting dichotomy and kept on stating that what he was trying to do was not a didactic kind of film you would find playing on certain TV stations. Rather, for him, this film was and I quote him, thinking in relations. And to quote him further, it was very important for me to say that it has to be a form of thinking in this film. I mean, you don't have to play it off against each other, but ideally it offers something different than verbal thinking, right? Building categories, as you said before. That is why I think it is nicely observed to say it's something different than building categories or structuring something in chapters in the way a textuality works. Instead, there is a weird kind of spatiality to it. What becomes a bit visible in this quote already is that he did specific practices to make this kind of representation happen. And I will mention a few of those practices now, but the list is of course not complete. For example, he connected his material in Korsakov through thematic keywords to make the relations visible. He used keywords such as museum, war, civil society, conservatory practices to connect his material, which he acquired on different sites in an African and a European country. Therefore, clips from one museum would likely be connected to clips from a different museum, and the statements would often also contradict. He also added text tables, so describing texts in the beginning of edited sequences or the beginning of the film were very important to his practice to ensure the viewers to be able to engage with the film and actually be able to build relations and not be distracted by their other confusion. So openness and complexity for him also always needs a certain framing. As a different aspect of this, he also made one clip where the restitution case is explained appear multiple times. So in Korsakov's speak, he gave them multiple lives. And that was meant for the viewers to be able to reflect back on the actual topic. And as this clip was pretty long, he wanted to encourage the viewers to watch it at least one time through. Also, he added material of sites that were talked about in interview clips, such as clips from a museum or a historical site. And these clips had a pretty sensory and atmospheric approach. No words were spoken or written in them. And he wanted the viewers to be able to wander in the picture and give them time to reflect on what they have seen so far and build relations. Also, he wanted to make visible that things will be left unseen. He arranged the clips in a way that made it possible to finish the film without having seen all of the clips in a database. And to make this visible, he added an interface in the end that showed all the clips one had not seen. And for this, he wanted to strengthen the idea that no representation of such a case can ever be complete. Another practice of this was also not including or even filming some material. As he said, he would not have enough material to even it out, as he put it, such as the site or rather the ruin of a never finished museum, which he thought would strengthen stereotypes and essentialism if it was part of his film. He allowed length in the sense that he included some interview clips up to 7 minutes, which he would not have done in a linear film. For this reason, he also timed the previews in a, as he said, non-didactic kind of way. That means they appeared from the beginning, so viewers could decide themselves when to continue, and also, to quote Christoph, to accelerate it if they wanted to. So his project also entails and works with interesting temporalities, as you might notice. A different example of this is that he has published it for now, but he's still undecided if he will keep working on it, as he says, because as he said, to add material in Korsakov is always pretty easy. You basically put the clip in the database, give it a few keywords, and then it will appear in your project. And another important aspect of his work is also that he published the film as part of a website. And on that website, he explained the scientific framing of his project and an accompanying text about restitution research, his approach, and his theoretical background. One question that kept popping up in my head during this case study was, what kind of knowledge is this? And how is Christoph treating this category of knowledge in his research? And I might have one fragmented idea of how to describe his approach, because I understand Christoph's approach or his stance towards knowledge making as a kind of knowledge as a messy assemblage. And with the word messy, I am referring to a concept of mess as described by John Law in 2004 and also by queer scholar Martin Manalansan from a queer methodological perspective around 2015. And when they talk about mess, they approach it from a methodological perspective. So using this concept therefore also means for me to define and understand interactive documentary as a method of representation. And John Law starts off his book, which has the title After Method, The Mess of Social Science, with this picture and captions it, "If this is an awful mess, then would something less messy make a mess of describing it?" And in his book, he takes into account the category of knowing and proposes to open up science's modalities of knowing. He's basically asking, how do our methods of research and representation try to describe stable, clear, and fixed knowledge when the world itself is actually very unstable? And what gets overlooked in these processes? And I'm quoting Law here. He writes, "Perhaps we will need to rethink our ideas about clarity and rigor and find ways of knowing the indistinct and the slippery without trying to grasp and hold them tight. Here, knowing will become possible through techniques of deliberate imprecision. Almost certainly, we will need to think hard about our relations with whatever it is we know and ask how far the process of knowing it also brings it into being." For Law, there are a few assumptions that are playing into understandings of this construct of reality that I will not get too much into at this point, but they are basically understanding methods as just there to collect what is already there. But Law instead states that methods are performative. There is no single independent world out there preceding us with definite structures. Rather, they are realities, and method and representation only bring them into being. And one significant quote or question that Law asks is, if realities made in methods are multiple, then do they have to be definite and fixed in form? To which the answer, at least for Christoph's project, would be no. So I hope it became apparent why I think this concept bears some great potential to describe Christoph's research stance. He also tries to represent a world that is not singular, that he himself and his research practices, and decisions have brought into being. And he wants to find a way to incorporate this in his representational practice. And he does so by using the form of interactive documentary with Korsakov, because he inherently has tied a hope to this form that it can do this. A hope that he also puts in perspective every now and then and warns about not falling for a, I quote, illusory hope. But it is still something that guides his practice. There is something he saw in this form that he could not have done in a linear form. And recognizing this stance brought me then to my research question, which are as following. So first of all, what epistemological stances can be recognized in interactive documentaries and their production processes? And as sub-questions to this, what specific practices can be identified? And how can these epistemological stances be made useful for visual ethnographic theory and methodology? So it would therefore also be a goal of mine to translate these findings in actual methodological approaches by formulating a research practice, a method, or a methodology. This is still pretty open though, and probably something for the last third of my PhD. All of this would, of course, also need a deep engagement with the word of epistemology and this category of knowledge, as I put it until now, which has not happened extensively enough yet. I can imagine the case study about Christoph's project to be one chapter in the dissertation to come. So maybe one epistemological stance towards knowledge making. Concerning my second sub-question, I would like to mention why I'm interested in connecting this to visual ethnographic discourses and methodologies. So first of all, when we look at visual ethnography writings, the category of knowledge pops up when Sarah Pink, for example, who is a leading scholar in Western visual ethnography, speaks of meaning making. She describes processes of analysis in visual ethnography as the examination of how different producers and viewers of images give subjective and contingent meaning to images, their content and form. So she points to the form here, which is significant for me as visual ethnography knows not just one standard form of representation. So Pink emphasizes how different forms of media represent different ways of knowing. So to pick up the research question again, I therefore ask, what ways of knowing can be found in the form of interactive documentary? And what does this reveal about visual ethnographic knowledge practices and meaning making? Second of all, and there my power critical interest reappears, there are several approaches to a reflexive visual ethnographic practice, such as by J. Ruby, who proposes strategies such as disclosing producer and methods of filmmaking in the film to rob the viewers of the illusion of the film. So it's pretty similar to alienation effects. At the same time, scholars like Trinity criticize, and not Ruby directly, but formalistic approaches to reflexivity. In an interview with Ea Hohenberger, Trinity said the following. So reflexivity does not just happen in one direction, as some progressive documentarists might think. And Hohenberger asks, who show their microphone, for example. Yes, that show the commentator or whoever is speaking, the director, for example. But that's it when it comes to reflexivity. It's just a formalistic procedure to situate their own subjectivity a little bit. But the kind of filmmaking doesn't change in the slightest way. As there are power critical hopes connected to the software, which are not just stated by Christoph himself. I mean, he got these hopes from somewhere, and they sometimes also go hand in hand with the promises of interactivity stemming from discourses in the 90s. Anyways, this also opens up questions that I find interesting concerning the understandings and approaches to reflexivities. What is the reflexivity here? Who is participating here and how? And how is this reflexivity power critical? Because a simple looking back at the filmmaker can be called reflexive. That does not make it power critical though. So this is just an outlook to questions that will concern me in the following months as well, and years, of course, also. And now I would like to thank you for listening to my presentation. And yes, I'm looking very forward to any feedback you might have.